On the afternoon of June 3rd, 1952, at approximately 3:47 p.m., Lieutenant Robert Bobby Dempsey stood on the corner of Lenox Avenue and 132nd Street and made a mistake that would cost him his career. He was standing in front of the Red Rooster, a soul food restaurant where half of Harlem ate lunch and the other half conducted business. 43 people were within earshot. Witnesses would later include a postal worker, 2 teachers from PS 194, a city sanitation employee, a journalist from the Amsterdam News, and at least a dozen residents who'd stopped to watch what was unfolding. Lieutenant Dempsey was 39 years old. He'd been with the NYPD for 16 years, the last 4 as a lieutenant in the 28th Precinct. He was 6'2", 210 pounds, with the kind of voice that carried across city blocks whether he wanted it to or not. And that afternoon, he wanted it to carry. He was speaking to, or more accurately, speaking at, a 15-year-old girl named Margaret Johnson, Bumpy Johnson's daughter. "You tell your father," Dempsey's voice boomed across Lenox Avenue, "that he doesn't run this neighborhood anymore. You tell him that the free ride is over. You tell him that if he keeps interfering with police operations, I will personally make sure that his family, your family, understands what happens when criminals think they're untouchable." Margaret Johnson stood frozen on the sidewalk, grocery bags in both hands, tears forming in her eyes. Dempsey wasn't finished. "You tell him that I know where you go to school. I know where your mother shops. I know where you live. And you tell him that badges mean something in this city, and his reputation means nothing to me." The street had gone completely silent. Car horns stopped. Conversations ceased. Even the elevated train rumbling past on the tracks above seemed to quiet, as if the city itself was holding its breath. Because everyone within earshot, everyone who called Harlem home, who understood the unwritten rules that govern the intersection of law enforcement and street power, knew that Lieutenant Robert Dempsey had just crossed a line that didn't get crossed. You could arrest Bumpy Johnson. You could investigate him. You could surveil him, pressure his associates, raid his operations. That was business. That was the game both sides played with unspoken understanding. But you did not, under any circumstances, for any reason, with any justification, publicly threaten a man's family. Especially not a 15-year-old girl. And especially not in the middle of Lenox Avenue, where witnesses could count into the dozens. Margaret Johnson dropped her grocery bags. Oranges rolled across the sidewalk. A glass bottle of milk shattered on the pavement. And she ran. She ran 6 blocks to the brownstone on West 147th Street, where her family lived. She ran, crying, gasping for breath, past neighbors who called out asking what was wrong. She ran up the steps, in through the front door, and into the living room, where her father was sitting with 3 associates discussing policy operations for the coming month. "Ellsworth, Bumpy!" Johnson looked up as his daughter burst into the room. He saw her face, the tears, the terror, the shame of having been humiliated in public. And in that instant, according to one of the men present that day, something changed in Bumpy's expression. Not anger, not rage, something colder, something calculated. He stood slowly, walked to his daughter, placed both hands on her shoulders. "Tell me exactly what happened. Every word. Take your time." Margaret told him. Every word, every threat, every implication, the location, the witnesses, the lieutenant's badge number, which she'd memorized because her father had always taught her. Remember details. Details are power. When she finished, Bumpy Johnson asked one question. "Did he touch you?" "No." "Did any officer touch you or try to stop you from leaving?" "No. I just ran." Bumpy nodded. Then he turned to the men in the room. "Gentlemen, we'll continue this meeting tomorrow. Something requires my immediate attention." The men left without questions. They understood. Some things took priority over business. Family was one of them. What happened next, between 4:23 p.m. on June 3rd, 1952, and 9:15 a.m. on June 4th, when Lieutenant Robert Dempsey received his transfer orders, would become one of the most discussed, debated, and analyzed demonstrations of power in Harlem's history. No shots were fired. No violence occurred. No one was threatened with physical harm. But in less than 17 hours, a lieutenant with 16 years of service, political connections, and union backing found himself reassigned to the 122nd Precinct in Staten Island, the NYPD equivalent of exile, with a notation in his permanent file that would ensure he never received another promotion for the rest of his career. And it all happened before he could even consider offering an apology. The question everyone in Harlem asked afterward wasn't how Bumpy Johnson made it happen. The question was, how long had he been preparing for a moment exactly like this? Because men like Bumpy Johnson, men who operated in the shadows while maintaining public legitimacy, who built empires on reputation and relationships rather than violence alone, don't react to threats impulsively. They don't scramble for solutions in moments of crisis. They activate networks that have been carefully constructed, meticulously maintained, and strategically positioned for exactly the moment when someone crosses the line. Lieutenant Robert Dempsey thought he was threatening a criminal's daughter that afternoon on Lenox Avenue. What he didn't understand was that he was triggering a response that had been 15 years in the making. A response that involved phone calls to people he'd never met, pressure points he didn't know existed, and documentation he never suspected had been compiled. By the time the sun set on June 3rd, 1952, Lieutenant Dempsey's fate was already sealed. He just didn't know it yet. To understand what happened on June 3rd, you need to understand Harlem in 1952. Not the Harlem of tourist brochures or jazz mythology, but the real Harlem. The neighborhood of 233,000 people compressed into 3.5 square miles, where the median family income was $2,847 per year, while Manhattan's median was $4,312. The Harlem where, according to the New York City Housing Authority, 68% of residential units were classified as deteriorating or dilapidated, where the infant mortality rate was 44.3 deaths per 1,000 live births, nearly double the citywide average of 23.8, where unemployment among black men aged 25 to 45 hovered around 18%, compared to 7% for white men in the same age bracket. But here's what the statistics didn't capture. Harlem in 1952 was also a neighborhood of extraordinary resilience, complex social structures, and parallel power systems that existed outside, and sometimes in direct opposition to official municipal authority. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson was 47 years old in 1952. He'd been operating in Harlem for 33 years, since arriving from South Carolina at age 14 in 1919. By 1952, he controlled an estimated $12 million in annual revenue flowing through numbers operations, policy games, and protection services. He employed over 400 people directly and provided income to thousands more indirectly. But more importantly, he'd spent 3 decades building relationships with politicians, with police captains, with judges, with journalists, with ministers, with labor organizers, with everyone who held any form of power or influence in Harlem and the broader New York political machine. He understood something that Lieutenant Robert Dempsey never grasped. Power in New York wasn't a pyramid with City Hall at the top. It was a web, interconnected, interdependent, and extremely vulnerable to pressure if you knew which threads to pull. Lieutenant Dempsey had been transferred to the 28th Precinct in January 1948. He came from a 19th Precinct on the Upper East Side, where policing meant protecting wealthy white residents from petty crime. He'd never worked in a neighborhood like Harlem, never understood the delicate balance between official law enforcement and street-level power brokers, never learned that respect wasn't taken. It was negotiated, established over time, and maintained through careful understanding of boundaries. His first mistake had been treating Harlem like occupied territory rather than a community. His second mistake had been assuming that his badge granted him immunity from consequences. His third and final mistake, the one that ended his career in the 28th Precinct, was believing that Bumpy Johnson's power was limited to criminal enterprises. It wasn't. By 1952, Bumpy had connections that extended far beyond Harlem streets. He donated to political campaigns. He provided security for civil rights gatherings. He mediated disputes between landlords and tenants, preventing riots that would have required expensive police interventions. He'd funded scholarship programs, supported churches, and maintained relationships with over 30 elected officials who understood that Bumpy's informal authority helped maintain order in ways that official policing never could. He also had something else: documentation. Just like in 1947, when he'd walked into the 32nd Precinct with 15 years of evidence, Bumpy maintained detailed records of police misconduct. Every excessive force complaint that disappeared, every unlawful arrest that got dismissed, every instance of corruption, theft, or abuse of power. And he had documentation on Lieutenant Robert Dempsey. Dempsey had been involved in 7 incidents between January 1948 and June 1952 that resulted in civilian complaints. 5 were dismissed as unfounded. 2 were marked insufficient evidence. But Bumpy had witness statements from all 7 incidents, signed affidavits, medical records, photographs, everything needed to reopen investigations if the right person asked the right questions. Additionally, Dempsey had taken bribes. Not from Bumpy. Bumpy never paid police unless absolutely necessary, but from others. Italian mobsters operating in East Harlem had paid Dempsey $850 in March 1951 to look the other way during a warehouse robbery. Bumpy had documentation, photographs of the meeting, a copy of the cash transfer, and testimony from an associate who'd witnessed the transaction. None of this information had been used. Yet, it sat in safety deposit boxes, in lawyers' offices, in sealed envelopes held by trusted associates. Waiting. That was Bumpy's strategy. Never attack first. Never escalate unnecessarily. But when someone crossed the line, when someone threatened family, especially children, activate every pressure point simultaneously. Which is exactly what happened after Margaret Johnson ran home crying on June 3rd, 1952. At 4:47 p.m. on June 3rd, 74 minutes after Lieutenant Dempsey's public threat, Bumpy Johnson made his first phone call. It went to Theodore Watkins, the same lawyer who'd notarized documents for him in 1947. Watkins was now 52 years old, with a thriving practice that included both legitimate clients and strategic representation of Harlem's less conventional power brokers. Theodore, Bumpy said calmly, "I need the Dempsey file. The complete file. On my desk in 2 hours." What happened? He threatened Margaret. Publicly. Lenox Avenue. 40-plus witnesses. There was silence on the other end of the line. Then, "I'll deliver it personally." The second call went to Reverend Calvin Harrison of the Mount Olivet Baptist Church on 120th Street. Reverend Harrison was 61 years old, a respected community leader who'd arrived in Harlem in 1923 and had spent nearly 3 decades building bridges between religious institutions, political organizations, and neighborhood associations. He also owed Bumpy Johnson several significant favors. In 1947, when the church faced foreclosure, Bumpy had quietly purchased the mortgage and transferred ownership back to the congregation. In 1950, when the Reverend's son was arrested on trumped-up charges, Bumpy had provided the lawyer who got the case dismissed. "Reverend," Bumpy said, "I need you to make a call to Councilman Webster. Tell him I need to speak with him this evening. Tell him it's urgent and it concerns police conduct toward a minor." "I'll call him immediately," Reverend Harrison said. He didn't ask for details. He understood that when Bumpy Johnson used the word urgent, it meant the careful balance that kept Harlem functioning was being threatened. The third call went to Marcus Tillman, editor of the Amsterdam News. Tillman was 43 years old, Harvard-educated, and deeply committed to covering stories that mainstream white newspapers ignored. He'd built the Amsterdam News into Harlem's most influential publication, with a readership of approximately 87,000 by 1952. Marcus, Bumpy said, "I'm sending someone to your office with witness statements. A police lieutenant threatened my 15-year-old daughter this afternoon. Public street. Dozens of witnesses. I want the story ready to print. When do you want it published? Hold it for now, but have it ready. If I call tomorrow morning and tell you to run it, I need it in the Thursday edition." "You'll have it," Tillman said. Then, more carefully, "Bumpy, if this happened the way you're describing, it's not just a story. It's a scandal. The NAACP will get involved. This could trigger federal attention." "I know," Bumpy said quietly. "That's why I'm giving them a chance to handle it quietly first. But if they don't handle it, if they circle the wagons and protect him, then everyone needs to know what kind of men are patrolling our streets." The fourth call went to James Patterson, a lieutenant at the 30th Precinct. Patterson was 45 years old, a 22-year veteran who'd worked in Harlem since 1938. Unlike Dempsey, Patterson understood the neighborhood. He knew the unwritten rules. He knew that maintaining order required cooperation, not confrontation. He also knew that Bobby Dempsey was a hothead who'd been causing problems since his transfer to Harlem 4 years earlier. "Lieutenant Patterson," Bumpy said formally, "I'm calling as a courtesy to inform you of an incident that occurred this afternoon involving Lieutenant Dempsey of the 28th and my daughter Margaret. I have 43 witnesses who can attest that Dempsey publicly threatened a minor. I'm bringing this to official attention through proper channels, but I wanted you to hear it from me directly." Patterson was quiet for a moment. Then, "How old is your daughter, Bumpy?" 15. "And Dempsey threatened her?" "Publicly, he did. Told her to relay threats to me. Mentioned knowing where she goes to school, where my wife shops, where we live. Implied consequences for my family if I didn't stop interfering with police operations." "Jesus Christ," Patterson muttered. Then, "You have witnesses?" 43 of them, including a teacher, a postal worker, and a journalist from the Amsterdam News who happened to be having lunch nearby. "I'll make calls," Patterson said. "Bobby Dempsey is an idiot, but threatening a teenager. That's beyond stupid. That's career-ending stupid." "I appreciate you hearing me out," Bumpy said. "I'm not looking for war. I'm looking for accountability. But if the department protects him, if they sweep this under the rug the way they've swept other things, then I'll have no choice but to pursue other options." "Understood," Patterson said. "Give me until tomorrow morning. I'll reach out to people who need to know about this." By 6 p.m., the machine was in motion. Theodore Watkins had delivered the Dempsey file, 142 pages of documentation covering 4 years of incidents, complaints, financial irregularities, and misconduct. Reverend Harrison had reached Councilman Webster, who agreed to meet with Bumpy at 8 p.m. Marcus Tillman had 2 reporters working on the story, interviewing witnesses on Lenox Avenue. Lieutenant Patterson had made phone calls to the 28th Precinct's captain and to 2 deputy inspectors at headquarters. And at 7:30 p.m., Bumpy Johnson received a visit from someone he hadn't called, Deputy Commissioner Gerald Hawkins, the same man who negotiated the 1947 agreement after Bumpy walked into the 32nd Precinct. Hawkins was now 61 years old, with 37 years on the force. He'd survived multiple mayors, 3 police commissioners, and countless departmental scandals by understanding one fundamental truth. Sometimes the unofficial power brokers were more important to keeping order than the official ones. He sat in Bumpy's study, declined an offered drink, and spoke bluntly. "I heard what happened," Hawkins said. "Lieutenant Patterson called me. He said Dempsey threatened your daughter in public." "He did. How many witnesses?" 43. Maybe more. Half the block was watching. Hawkins rubbed his face with both hands. "Bobby Dempsey is an idiot. I've said so for years. But he has connections. His uncle is a deputy mayor. His cousin is a state assemblyman. Getting him disciplined is complicated." "Then uncomplicated," Bumpy said quietly. "Because if this gets handled the way things usually get handled, If complaints disappear, if witnesses suddenly can't remember what they saw, if my daughter has to live with the fear that a police lieutenant might follow through on his threats, then I will burn down every bridge I've spent 30 years building. Hawkins looked at him steadily. What do you want? Transfer. Out of Harlem. Permanent. And a formal note in his file that ensures he never supervises officers in any black neighborhood again. That's career damage. Significant career damage. He threatened my 15-year-old daughter in front of 43 witnesses, Bumpy said, and for the first time his voice carried emotion, cold, controlled fury. He humiliated a child to send a message to her father. He used his badge and his authority to terrorize someone who couldn't fight back. So yes, I want career damage. I want him to understand that badges don't grant immunity from consequences. Hawkins was silent for a long moment. Then he asked, if we transfer him, will you keep this quiet? No newspaper story? No NAACP involvement? No federal attention? If he's transferred by tomorrow, if the order is signed and processed before he has a chance to apologize, to claim he was misunderstood, to make excuses, then yes. It stays quiet, but the documentation stays on file. And if he ever tries to retaliate or contact my family again, everything goes public. I'll need to make calls, Hawkins said. Make them. If you've been following this story and wondering how information becomes leverage, how documentation becomes power, then you're beginning to understand why these historical moments matter. Because they show us that change doesn't always come from protests or legislation. Sometimes it comes from one person saying enough is enough and having the preparation to back up that declaration with action. But right now, in June 1952, the question everyone in Harlem was asking wasn't whether Bumpy could make this happen. It was how fast. Deputy Commissioner Hawkins left Bumpy's brownstone at 8:17 p.m. His first call went to Police Commissioner George Monahan, who'd held the position since 1950. Monahan was 59 years old, a career administrator who understood that managing New York City's police force required balancing political pressures, union demands, and the complex realities of urban law enforcement. Hawkins explained the situation. A lieutenant had publicly threatened a minor. Multiple witnesses, including credible community members, teachers, a postal worker, a journalist. The father was Ellsworth Johnson, which meant complications beyond a typical complaint. What does Johnson want? Monahan asked. Transfer. Out of Harlem. Permanent. And a notation in Dempsey's file. Dempsey's connected. His uncle will make noise. Then let him make noise, Hawkins said. Because if we don't handle this quietly, it becomes a newspaper story. Civil rights story. Federal investigation story. The kind of story that makes us look like we tolerate officers threatening children. Monahan was quiet. Then, give me until morning. I'll talk to the deputy mayor. See if we can arrange something that satisfies Johnson without triggering a political firestorm. At 9 p.m., Bumpy met with Councilman Arthur Webster at the councilman's office on 125th Street. Webster was 52 years old, representing Harlem's 11th district since 1946. He was black, Harvard-educated, and walked a careful line between representing his constituents and maintaining relationships with City Hall's power brokers. He listened as Bumpy explained what had happened. Then he asked the same question everyone asked. What do you want? I want Lieutenant Dempsey transferred out of Harlem. I want it done quickly, quietly, and permanently. And I want to guarantee that no officer will retaliate against my family. Webster leaned back in his chair. If I push this, if I use my position to pressure the department, I need to know you'll keep your end quiet. No publicity, no headlines. Because the moment this becomes a public fight, it's not about your daughter anymore. It's about politics. And politics gets messy. I understand. But I also need you to understand something, Councilman. I've spent 30 years working within the system, respecting boundaries, handling problems quietly, building relationships instead of burning bridges. But there are lines, and threatening my daughter crosses one. I'll make calls in the morning, Webster said. I'll talk to the police commissioner's office, to the mayor's staff, to whoever needs to hear that this needs to be handled. But, Bumpy, this kind of leverage only works once. After this, the goodwill's spent. The relationships get strained. You sure you want to use it now? My daughter came home crying, Bumpy said quietly. She was terrified, humiliated in front of her neighborhood. If I don't respond to that, if I let a police officer threaten my family without consequences, then what's my reputation worth? What's my protection worth? Webster nodded. I'll make the calls. At 10:30 p.m., Marcus Tillman called Bumpy from the Amsterdam news offices. His reporters had interviewed 17 witnesses from Lenox Avenue. Every account confirmed the same story. Lieutenant Dempsey had confronted Margaret Johnson, delivered explicit threats, and made it clear he was targeting the family because of Bumpy's activities. This is front-page material, Tillman said. Police lieutenant threatens minor in racial neighborhood. We can frame it as civil rights abuse, excessive authority targeting families. This could be national news. Hold the story, Bumpy said. Give them until tomorrow to handle it internally. And if they don't, then run it. Front page. Don't hold back. You're gambling they'll do the right thing. No, Bumpy corrected. I'm giving them the option to avoid embarrassment. There's a difference. At 11:45 p.m., Lieutenant James Patterson called Bumpy with an update. He'd spoken with Captain Morris of the 28th Precinct, with Deputy Inspector Charles Warren, and with several other officers who'd worked with Dempsey over the years. Nobody's defending him, Patterson said. Even the guys who usually back officers, no matter what, are saying Bobby crossed the line. Threatening a teenager? In public? That's indefensible. But the problem is his uncle. Deputy Mayor Richard Dempsey is making calls, trying to protect his nephew, saying it's a misunderstanding, that Bobby was just trying to deliver a message and it came out wrong. It came out exactly how he intended, Bumpy said. He wanted to intimidate my daughter to send a message to me. That's not a misunderstanding. That's abuse of power. I agree. And so does everyone I've talked to. But the deputy mayor has influence. If he pushes hard enough, this could get buried. Then we'll unbury it, Bumpy said. Tell whoever needs to know. If this gets buried, it becomes a federal case. I've already contacted civil rights attorneys. I have documentation. I have witnesses. I have everything needed to make this a national story about police targeting black families. The department can handle it quietly now, or they can handle it publicly later. Their choice. Patterson was quiet for a moment. You're not bluffing, are you? I never bluff, Bumpy said. I prepare, and then I act. At 1:30 a.m. on June 4th, Police Commissioner Monahan called Deputy Mayor Richard Dempsey. The conversation lasted 11 minutes. Monahan explained the situation, credible witnesses, undeniable facts, potential federal involvement, guaranteed negative publicity. He explained that protecting Lieutenant Dempsey would create more problems than it solved. Deputy Mayor Dempsey argued. He claimed his nephew was being targeted, that Johnson was manipulating the situation, that this was about criminal resentment of legitimate law enforcement. Monahan cut him off. Richard, I've read the preliminary reports. Your nephew threatened a 15-year-old girl in front of 43 witnesses. There's no interpretation where that's acceptable behavior. If we protect him, we're telling every black family in Harlem that police officers can terrorize their children without consequences. Is that the message you want to send? Silence. I'm transferring him, Monahan continued. I'm sending him to Staten Island. He'll keep his rank, keep his pension track, but he's out of Harlem. Permanently. And there will be a notation in his file. This isn't negotiable. You're ending his career, Deputy Mayor Dempsey said quietly. No, Monahan corrected. He ended his career when he threatened child. I'm just documenting it. The call ended at 1:41 a.m. At 2:15 a.m., Commissioner Monahan called Deputy Commissioner Hawkins. Draft the transfer orders. Lieutenant Robert Dempsey, 28th Precinct, reassigned to the 122nd Precinct, Staten Island. Effective immediately. Notation in permanent file regarding conduct unbecoming an officer. Have it on my desk by 7 a.m. It'll be ready, Hawkins said. At 7:43 a.m. on June 4th, the transfer orders were signed. At 8:30 a.m., they were delivered to Captain Morris at the 28th Precinct with instructions to notify Lieutenant Dempsey immediately. At 9:15 a.m., Lieutenant Robert Dempsey was called into Captain Morris's office and handed the transfer papers. According to witnesses, his face went white. He asked why. He demanded an explanation. He invoked his uncle's name, his years of service, his clean record. Captain Morris simply said, "You threatened a civilian minor in public." Multiple witnesses. The department doesn't tolerate that behavior. You report to the 122nd Precinct on Monday. You're dismissed. 17 hours and 28 minutes after Margaret Johnson ran home crying, Lieutenant Robert Dempsey's career in Harlem was over. He never got the chance to apologize, never got the chance to explain, never got the chance to claim misunderstanding or miscommunication. The transfer order arrived before he even knew there were consequences coming. News traveled fast in Harlem. By 10 a.m. on June 4th, word had spread through the neighborhood that Lieutenant Dempsey had been transferred. Not retired, not suspended, transferred to Staten Island, the precinct assignment that every cop understood as punishment. People gathered on Lenox Avenue where the incident had occurred the previous day. They discussed what it meant, what it signaled, what had changed. Sarah Matthews, the postal worker who'd witnessed the confrontation, was interviewed by the Amsterdam News the next day. "I couldn't believe what I was hearing," she told the reporter. A police officer, in uniform, threatening a 15-year-old girl, telling her he knew where she went to school. It was terrifying, and I thought, like I always think, that nothing would happen, that he'd get away with it, because that's how it always works. But then, he was gone, just like that, transferred, and I realized something had changed. What had changed wasn't just one lieutenant's assignment. What had changed was the understanding that there were limits, lines that couldn't be crossed without consequences, even for men with badges, even for men with political connections. Reverend Calvin Harrison preached that Sunday about justice and accountability. He never mentioned Bumpy Johnson by name, never referenced the specific incident. But everyone in the congregation understood what he meant when he said, "There are those who think power protects them from consequences, who believe that authority means immunity. But righteousness has its own power, and sometimes, when the system fails, individuals must stand up and demand better." The congregation said, "Amen," with unusual fervor. Councilman Arthur Webster held a town hall meeting on June 12th to discuss police-community relations in Harlem. He announced that the police department had agreed to implement new oversight procedures for complaints involving minors. Every complaint filed by someone under 18 would receive automatic review by a civilian board. Every incident involving threats or intimidation would require written justification from the officer involved. These weren't revolutionary changes, but they were something. Small acknowledgments that the previous system had been failing, that adjustments were necessary, that accountability mattered. Lieutenant James Patterson was promoted to captain in August 1952 and transferred to the 28th Precinct to replace the departing Captain Morris. His first act was to hold a meeting with every officer in the precinct and deliver a clear message. Harlem isn't enemy territory. These aren't enemy civilians. They're New Yorkers. They deserve respect, protection, and fair treatment. Any officer who can't provide that should request a transfer now. 3 officers requested transfers within the month. As for Lieutenant Robert Dempsey, he served at the 122nd Precinct in Staten Island for exactly 11 months. The notation in his file, "Conduct unbecoming an officer involving threats toward a civilian minor," ensured he was passed over for every promotion opportunity. In May 1953, he resigned from the NYPD, citing personal reasons. He never returned to Harlem, never contacted the Johnson family, never offered an apology. But he also never forgot what had happened. Years later, In a 1967 interview conducted for an oral history project about NYPD experiences, Dempsey was asked about his time in Harlem. He declined to discuss specifics but said, "I learned that power isn't just about position. It's about preparation. Some people spend years building networks, collecting information, establishing relationships. And when you cross them, you discover they've been ready for that moment for a long time." The interviewer pressed, "Do you regret anything about your time in Harlem?" Dempsey was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I regret not understanding the neighborhood before trying to police it. I regret thinking a badge made me untouchable. And I regret a lot of things." He never elaborated, but people who knew the story understood what he meant. What happened in June 1952 wasn't an isolated incident. It was a demonstration of a system that had been built over decades, a parallel structure of power that existed alongside official institutions, sometimes in cooperation with them, sometimes in opposition, but always present. Bumpy Johnson had spent 33 years building that system, cultivating relationships, collecting information, establishing credibility with people who could apply pressure when pressure was needed. The phone calls he made on June 3rd weren't desperate appeals. They were activations. He called people who owed him favors, yes. But more importantly, he called people who understood that maintaining balance in Harlem required cooperation between official and unofficial power structures. Theodore Watkins, the lawyer, had built a practice representing both legitimate clients and street-level operators. He understood that law existed in theory and in practice, and that sometimes the gap between them required navigation by people who understood both worlds. Reverend Calvin Harrison represented spiritual authority, but also community authority. His congregation included city employees, teachers, nurses, sanitation workers, people whose cooperation was essential for Harlem to function. When he endorsed something, it carried weight. Councilman Arthur Webster represented electoral authority. He'd been elected by Harlem residents and owed his position to their support. When he applied pressure to the police department, it wasn't just one politician making noise. It was the political representative of 233,000 people demanding accountability. Lieutenant James Patterson represented institutional authority, but he was also a realist. He understood that policing Harlem required cooperation with community leaders, including unconventional ones. He understood that officers who treated residents as enemies created more problems than they solved. And Deputy Commissioner Gerald Hawkins represented pragmatic authority. He'd been navigating NYPD politics for 37 years. He knew that sometimes protecting the department's reputation required disciplining officers who made the department look bad. All of these people existed in Bumpy Johnson's network, not because they were corrupt, not because they were criminals, but because they understood that maintaining order in a complex urban environment required more than just enforcing laws. It required relationships, trust, mutual respect, and willingness to hold people accountable regardless of their position. When Lieutenant Dempsey threatened Margaret Johnson, he wasn't just attacking one family. He was threatening the stability of an entire system. He was demonstrating that some officers believed they were above accountability, that badges granted immunity, that black families could be terrorized without consequences. And that couldn't stand. Not because Bumpy Johnson was a hero. He wasn't. Not because the system was just, it wasn't. But because the alternative was chaos. If police officers could threaten children without consequences, then what stopped them from doing worse? If unofficial power brokers like Bumpy couldn't protect their own families, then what protection could they offer anyone else? The transfer of Lieutenant Dempsey sent a message that echoed far beyond one precinct assignment. It said that there were limits, that accountability existed even when official channels failed, that preparation and documentation and relationships could create consequences when consequences seemed impossible. Margaret Johnson was never interviewed about the incident. Her father protected her from media attention, from follow-up questions, from becoming a symbol in a story larger than herself. She continued attending school, living her life, growing up in Harlem. But years later, in a 1978 interview conducted for a book about her father's life, she reflected on what happened. "I was terrified that day. I thought nothing would happen. I thought that's just how things were. Police could say whatever they wanted, do whatever they wanted, and we just had to accept it. But my father, he didn't accept it. He didn't get angry. He didn't threaten anyone. He just made phone calls. And the next day, that lieutenant was gone. Just gone. And I realized something. Power isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it's patient. Sometimes it's about knowing exactly what to do and exactly who to call when someone crosses a line." That's the real lesson of June 3rd and 4th, 1952. Not that violence solves problems. Not that revenge is justified. But that preparation matters. That documentation creates leverage. That relationships built over decades can be activated in hours. That power exercised quietly is often more effective than power exercised loudly. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson died in 1968 at age 62. He never spent significant time in prison after 1952. He maintained his operations, his relationships, his influence. He became a legend, the man who controlled Harlem, who balanced between legitimacy and criminality, who understood power in ways that most people never could. But ask anyone who knew him what made him most effective, and they wouldn't mention violence. They wouldn't mention money. They'd mention preparation. They'd mention patience. They'd mention his ability to see threats coming and have responses ready before the threats fully materialized. Lieutenant Robert Dempsey's transfer took 17 hours from threat to execution. But the preparation that made it possible took 33 years. Every relationship Bumpy built, every favor he granted, every piece of documentation he collected, every phone number he maintained, every bridge he chose not to burn, all of it came together in those 17 hours. And when Margaret Johnson ran home crying on June 3rd, 1952, her father didn't scramble to figure out what to do. He activated networks that had been waiting for exactly that moment. He made phone calls to people who'd been positioned for exactly that purpose. He applied pressure that had been building for exactly that long. And by the morning of June 4th, before Lieutenant Robert Dempsey even understood what was happening, his transfer orders were signed and his career in Harlem was finished. No shots fired. No violence. No public confrontation. Just consequences. Swift. Certain. Inevitable. That's the power that matters. Not the power to hurt, but the power to hold accountable. The power to say no further and make it stick. The power to protect family, protect community, protect the lines that separate order from chaos. 43 people witnessed Lieutenant Dempsey threaten a 15-year-old girl on Lenox Avenue that afternoon. By the next morning, those same 43 people witnessed something else, proof that even men with badges could face consequences when they crossed the wrong lines. And in a neighborhood where consequences so often seemed impossible, where power so frequently went unchecked, where justice was more theory than practice, that proof mattered. It mattered to Margaret Johnson, who learned that her father's protection was real. It mattered to the witnesses, who learned that speaking up could actually change outcomes. It mattered to the police officers in Harlem, who learned that treating residents as enemies had costs. And it mattered to everyone who understood that lasting change doesn't come from destruction. It comes from preparation, from documentation, from relationships, from understanding exactly how power works and exactly how to apply pressure when pressure becomes necessary. Lieutenant Robert Dempsey's transfer order arrived before an apology for a reason. Because apologies come after consequences, not instead of them. And on June 4th, 1952, 17 hours after threatening the wrong man's daughter, Lieutenant Dempsey learned that lesson the hard way.